Hi, and welcome to an episode of the JetRails podcast. I'm Robert, your host, and today we're going to be talking about how message queuing is modernizing Magento to store performance. For those that aren't familiar with message queuing, you're going to learn exactly what it's all about in today's episode. Really excited to have a couple of great guests with us today. We have Ed, who's here with the Rabbitmq team over at VMware, and we've got Rob from the Core Shop Solutions team. And with no further ado, gentlemen, I'm going to pass you the baton to introduce yourselves. Ed, would you do the honors of going first?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Robert. Hi, I'm Ed Byford. I'm the product lead for Rabbitmq at VMware. And VMware has a brand called Tanzu, which is essentially the application modernization brand. And it's driven essentially by cloud-native architecture and technologies which were acquired from Pivotal, Bitnami, Heptio, and Wavefront. So we really exist as a division to help developers use those technologies to help companies modernize their application stacks. And within that, there's a subdivision called Data Services, Tanzu Data Services. And the Rabbitmq team sits within Tanzu Data Services. So there's a commercial brand of Tanzu Rabbitmq, which is based on the open source Rabbitmq. And unlike some of the other products in the portfolio, we are actually the core contributors to Rabbitmq. So it exists as a single vendor open source offering.
Awesome. We certainly love our open source friends here at JetRails. So glad to have you. And Rob, of course, we know your team very well. We service clients together. Could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I'm the Chief Digital Officer of Core Shop Solutions, and I feel like this has been the culmination of my entire career, from engineering to marketing to product management to sales. And now I lead the digital solutions for Core Shop. Core Shop Solutions was born out of a PIM, product information management system, and we've since gone on to become a major Magento house, connected and connecting very complex B2B solutions, which is one of the reasons we like working with Rabbitmq.
Awesome. I suppose we should probably take it a little bit from the top before we get too deep into the weeds in this particular episode. So I'm going to open up asking a little bit about what is a message queuing service. And Ed, since this is sort of from a product standpoint, really in your wheelhouse, do you have a good way of breaking that down for business owners and folks that might not see this in action every day, but that could very much benefit from it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we talk about what a message queuing service is, I like to start with a bit of history, because I think it really helps couch the advantages, the benefits that a message queuing service brings, and kind of how it developed over time. Because when we think about the early days of data integration, it started off by allowing access to a shared file or a shared database. And that really brought a number of good guarantees. It guarantees that different applications are getting the same view of the data, different people around the organization are getting that same view. But if that data is changing very frequently, then it becomes difficult to scale. And then often if you had to then integrate new sources of data, then you had to rewrite some of the data structure in your database and try and make that work for the folks. But back in the 1980s, there was a chap called Vivek Ranadive, who was working at Goldman Sachs at the time. And he had a background in electronic engineering, where he'd studied motherboards, he'd studied electronic components, he'd studied computer components, and he recognized that there was a component called the hardware bus that essentially offered components within the motherboard, essentially a source of information that they could all plug into, could understand what was happening around the computer. And he wondered why there wasn't such an easily shared source of information for software components. So Vivek came up with the information bus, which is essentially a bus for software. And set up a company called Technicron, which owned that. And eventually Reuters bought that technology. And that was really the start of the kind of enterprise service bus era. IBM saw that the tech that the information bus was being run on IBM hardware. And so they decided to come out with a competitor, which was IBM MQ, or message queuing, which since has morphed into various things, and WebSphere MQ is what it is today. So this enterprise service bus model became really popular. And one of the reasons it was really popular was because of the fact that it was a common communication plane. You had different application developers around the organization, different groups, able to plug into a central place. They used adapters to do things like connection and translation between those different components. And it also allowed for handling of security, authorization, as part of that enterprise service bus. And it was also loved by people, enterprise architects, who were really seeing it as a method of some level of control over the communications that was happening within organization. So it became a useful method for people to understand what was happening. And really, they did solve some problems early on. They do have some limitations with regards to scale and performance. So because it's centrally controlled, you need some planning to assure that central point can handle the number of connections that your organization, that your use case is going to need. And if that rate of change is too great, or there's a dynamic architecture, or the complexity increases, then it can become difficult for an enterprise service bus to handle. And so, in addition to those problems, those different enterprise service buses like IBM MQ, Microsoft MQ, TIBCO, which is what the information bus company became when it spun out of Reuters, they all use proprietary protocols in order to connect into those buses. And there was a solution to that. It was called the Java Message Service. So it attempted to solve that lock-in by providing a common API, common Java API, which hides the actual interface into the individual message queue. And so technically, you could have written an app that uses that API, and then that Java Message Service API takes care of the communication with the bus. It was somewhat successful, certainly became very popular, but it wasn't ideal. It kind of glued this API interface over multiple diverse interfaces. And those individual service buses didn't have much of a say or much of an incentive to make that compatible. They were sort of walled gardens in a sense. Now we're moving on to financial services. That's where this became really popular, this kind of model. And JP Morgan Chase were at some point got fed up with the idea that there had to be these different kinds of protocols. And they actually started to develop a common open standard, which is called the Advanced Message Queuing Protocol, or AMQP. And that was kind of created in 2004. And this is kind of getting onto the genesis of Rabbitmq and how this came about, because we have two people who were in London at the time. I have Alexis Richardson and Matthias Raderstock. And Alexis had started a company which was using Java objects for distributed computing, and having, as the story goes, some success, but some complications along the way. And he was actually leasing office space from a company called L-Shift, and that's where he met Matthias. So Alexis had this interest in distributed computing. Matthias was interested in Erlang, which is a programming language which Ericsson actually developed for their telephone switching gear. And Erlang excels at doing things like distributed programming, allowing for robust failure recovery, because it was really designed for these bits of hardware that were distributed across the globe, and to allow them to recover well from failure in an independent manner. So Alexis and Matthias met, and they quickly discovered that there could be a synthesis, a sort of a synergy between Erlang and the ideas that that Alexis had around distributed computing. They found that Erlang produced this really incredible latency that was comparable to using raw sockets. So, it was going to be very efficient for some distributed computing. And at the time, Alexis thought, well, I could see some benefits to making an app stack and tools for what would become cloud computing in the future. And he saw messaging as a key part of that. And no one was really touching messaging at the time. The market was dominated by those large proprietary players that we talked about earlier, the TIBCOs, the IBMs. And so he saw the opportunity to make something that would provide messaging without being tied into those things. And that's where Rabbit Technologies came about. And I know, going on to, that's essentially the genesis. And the reason I mention AMQP is because Rabbit was based around that open standard that came from JP Morgan Chase back in 2004.
Wow.
Yeah.
A bit of history there.
I had no idea, but I like it that you took it all the way back to the 80s. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I think it's important to kind of see that transition and to understand where we're at today, because I think where we're at today is developed over a number of different industries. Some people say that the consumer electronics and consumer software market is really pushed by certain industries around vice, like gambling and online gaming, and all these things are pushing consumer technologies forward. But in enterprise software, it always seems to be financial services and trading and those kinds of companies and industries that push that forward. And that's certainly true for
I think we can welcome them into the vice category. I think it's all right.
Absolutely. Yeah, maybe you're right.
They just don't go to prison, but it's still, I think that they, they're there.
Couple do.
It's interesting. And you mentioned message queuing in correlation with APIs and how early on these things were being stitched together. From a 30,000 foot view, what is the core difference between simply letting a couple of APIs talk to each other and leveraging a solution like Rabbitmq or a different queuing service?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think I'd use this analogy, which was described to me some years ago, and which I've always found quite useful, is that message queuing, a message broker, is sort of like the postman and the mail sorting office all in one. So if we didn't have the postman or the mailman, then every time you needed to send a letter, you'd then have to know how to physically reach the house of the person you needed to send the letter to. And then when you sent a letter and you need to know that it's delivered to the person you want it to be delivered to, if the person wasn't available, you have to go back again and re-deliver it yourself. So at the time you're thinking about trying to deliver that letter, you're doing all this traveling, and you wouldn't be able to do anything else. It would be kind of a blocking operation. You'd just be spending all your time being the mailman. And that's very similar to what an API call, a request response, is like. You've got an application sitting on one side of the fence and needs to communicate with another application, and it's trying to do so by implementing a load of logic on both sides in both applications that tell them how to communicate with each other, what to do if the other one isn't available, how to find the other one. All of these things are needed to be in both applications. They've both got to be online for the message to be actually sent. And so thinking about how that relates to a message queuing service, if you think of putting a message broker in the middle, which is what Rabbitmq is, you're essentially asking the application to talk to one point. That's Rabbitmq. Rabbitmq then handles consuming applications coming in, pulling or having messages subscribed to an exchange, getting messages from that central broker, and then it really offloads the work of handling those common delivery scenarios. So point to point, doing things like retrying failed deliveries, implementing delivery guarantees like publisher confirmations and client acknowledgements, And you're really offloading all of that to Rabbitmq, a message broker, which is specialized and experienced in doing this. And it also allows for other things as well, other common delivery patterns like pub sub, which is less like sending a single letter and more like having, subscribing to a newsletter. So you're producing application, your publishing application publishes once to one place, that's Rabbitmq. And then you have applications, consumers coming in and subscribing, and they don't necessarily need to know, well, they don't need to know about each other. They just need to know where to look, how to subscribe, and what messages they'll pull from that.
Interesting. So, Rob, I'm going to pull the conversation a little bit toward the Magento side of things here, because I think it's particularly interesting that Rabbitmq has become a native integration for Magento 2. It's a core integration. Why are Magento 2 stores opting to use Rabbitmq instead of MySQL for their message queuing? Is it a particular performance boost? Is it, relieving congestion? I certainly know that in these robust e-commerce sites, from my vantage point, you don't want to put any more weight on the database on MySQL than you absolutely have to. That's already being taxed quite quite readily. But from your perspective, what's going on in the core outside of using a system like Rabbitmq above and beyond the core functionality?
Sure. So I think it is all of those, but it's actually one more thing that customers really care about: cost. It is a lot faster to connect systems, and especially multiple systems. So our customers, for example, commerce is becoming faster, more demanding. It's becoming much more complex and rich, right? So that richness requires potentially connecting a variety of systems, right? Delivery, product data, pricing data. Sometimes they live together. Most often they don't. And when they don't, right, the idea that you can use Rabbitmq natively connected to Magento, you can essentially cut out half the work. You can easily connect to a variety of systems, get information back and forth, not only just to Magento, but if desired, since it's a bus, we often will get information back and forth to other systems. We tend to build very complex systems. So one of the places we connect to is a product information management system, but it allows information to sit and reside where it is. It reduces the load, it's faster, and it's cheaper. And you very rarely get that combination for customers.
Absolutely. From the web hosting perspective, we see users more and more spinning it up the same way that they ask us in their environments to make sure that they have Elasticsearch, which is now native for search in the newer versions of Magento 2 for open source and for Adobe Commerce. And, it has become the standard, of course. It's another thing happening in the background. Sometimes the merchants themselves don't necessarily know what it is or what it's doing or how it's being used in the core. But Rob, I think that's particularly interesting, that as opposed to just sticking to what it's doing in the core to relieve congestion, being able to really leverage it for third-party integrations, for multi-channel or omni-channel or unified commerce integrations. I think our teams have a case study with Xander's, where your team did some very interesting integration work with ERP and with a variety of systems, and not just maybe one solution, but more of a full circle of meeting all the business needs more elegantly. I'll be sure to link to that one in the show notes. But has this really replaced a lot of the older API integration work from your perspective?
Yes. In fact, we prefer Rabbitmq. It may not make me as much money, but it's the right thing for the customer. And here's an example why, right? Let's talk about Xander's. Xander's had tremendously slow response, a lot of latency issues, some of which was due to hosting, some of which was due to integration. The ERP you mentioned, for example, a lot of companies are using legacy systems, or even in the case of Xander's, an ERP with 12 customers. So it's not widely known. It's a bit of a pain to work with. Being able to simplify that integration, right? Speed up the information flow and actually do it in such a way that's much lighter and easier on Magento, sped up the Magento performance. Then working obviously with JetRails, we solved a number of the performance issues on that side. Together, we were able to take response time from a totally abysmal 5 seconds to well under half a second. I think it's closer to 0.2. I'd have to look at that case, but that kind of change, what it does is it makes your customers happier, and it actually makes them convert more. Right? You can't wait in today's age for that slow a Magento application. But you mentioned search. Let me just bring that up really short. It's one of the things we like to work on because, again, it makes a huge conversion point. And that is, so many times, small and even large customers have very limited descriptions, very limited amounts of information on their stores. Increasing that information, making it easier to use Elasticsearch, I like to call it finding. And Rabbitmq allows us to pull multiple sources of data and put them together so that we actually get the amount of data necessary to do a good search. Underlying, we really are proud of our partnership with Rabbitmq. We're really proud of our abilities using it. And every one of our customers has walked away delighted when we're really coming in and either building new or fixing failed.
And, in the case of Xander's, the thing that stuck with me from that case study, I want to say that they had a 3x increase in overall revenue through their website after both of our teams were done with our various upgrades and updates for them. So, an established B2B business that's been around for decades, if I recall correctly. So
80 years.
Wow. Okay, longer than I was thinking. But I try not to judge by age. It all usually gets me in trouble. But outside of Magento, I'm sure that based on the work that both of you are engaged with on an ongoing basis, you've seen some interesting use cases for Rabbitmq specifically. Anything stand out? Anything that you think is innovative or noteworthy from different projects that you've been involved with or been aware of? And Ed, maybe we'll turn it back to you first.
Yeah, thank you. And it's really interesting to hear more about the work that Rob's doing and recognizing, reducing latency. I think makes me think of other websites and platforms that we're all aware of. So Reddit uses Rabbitmq for basically every single user action on the site. And a lot of our web interface customers or our web customers use Rabbitmq because it allows for that responsiveness of the front end to be decoupled from what's happening in the back end. So I'm thinking also of uploading a profile photo. Perhaps there's some processing that needs to be done on the image on the back end when you're uploading, but the response can be back to the customer or back to the user when they've uploaded that image can be instant, and that can be a non-blocking process, that responsiveness. And then the back end processor can go off and handle what needs to be done with that image and guarantee that to the front end that a response will come back. And so that's really what we see happening. with those web interfaces and increasing that responsiveness. But I also think about that decoupling being not just time wise, but also geography. So if you've got a Rabbitmq in one data center, a Rabbitmq in a second data center, and you connect the two, then they act as kind of a buffer between, for handling latency on that connection or even, network connectivity issues. So thinking about something like a shipping company where they might have subsidiaries in several different geographies and areas, connecting back to a central headquarters that can handle, the integration point and checking against various records. Having Rabbitmq decouple that communication can mean, better resiliency, certainly, because those messages, if there's any network connectivity, those messages will be queued on one side or the other, and then it can be retried later at a later stage. Also allows for scalability because you can add new geographies and just have that connection created via Rabbitmq as a single point, as opposed to having multiple applications have to know about that. So there's certainly, a lot of IoT use cases we're seeing nowadays, and edge use cases where we find that there are low power devices, perhaps, in a retail location, in, a supermarket or some other retail store, where they need to, for data security purposes, have customer data held in a central place, somewhere that is, very secure and subject to those data privacy regulations that are obviously very important for personal data. And yet they need that connectivity between the branch, the customer-facing branch, and that central place. So they'll use Rabbitmq on both sides of that connection in order to make sure that those messages and that communication can happen back and forth while still handling that communication at the edge, which sometimes, due to that network connectivity, is not as performant as when you're hosted in the same data center. So yeah, we see those kinds of use cases a lot nowadays.
Interesting. And pulling that back even further into e-commerce, which, dealing with retail and other things certainly is, but you were mentioning having data managed in one location, one source of truth, as I'll typically refer to it. So whether you're talking about inventory management or order management, or some of these different facets of successfully running an e-commerce business of scale, that's going to happen if you're selling through multiple online channels, through your website or websites, through Amazon, eBay, Walmart, whatever marketplaces, whatever's going on. Your inventory is going to be managed somewhere. You're not going to separately manage a separate quota of inventory for each of these, completely, separate from each other. It's all coming out of the same warehouses. So at that point, this all becomes a challenge. And so I imagine one of the native benefits is that if there is a connectivity issue and something does go down, the whole nature of queuing is that the messages are still there queued up, waiting for a connection to be available, waiting for whatever, outage or whatever other issue to be addressed, to be solved, so that really, there could be a delay if there's an internet issue, but things don't get lost, that there's that broker in the middle, as opposed to some of the earlier integrations that we'd see that would fail a lot because there were no checks and balances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And having the ability to have that flow of information be available to more components, to more parts of your organization, can enable some really interesting use cases. So in terms of looking at what's happening within a particular marketing campaign or a particular campaign on your shop front. It used to be that data would flow back, would be condensed, would be consolidated on a periodic basis. And that would mean that marketing campaigns could be reviewed every day, every week, something like that, where you'd have a kind of checkpoint to see, right, what's the data that's happening? How are people clicking? How are people interacting with our website? But having the ability to have more sources of information or more processing applications connected into something like Rabbitmq can mean that you actually receive a flow of information closer to real time, and you can actually then make changes to those campaigns as you're going through. So doing, changing the A/B test or changing the shape of the button or the color of the button and making those kinds of tweaks, even, as you're going along on an hourly basis, even minute by minute, all of those things are possible. And people talk about the event-driven architectures being a key part of how companies nowadays react to what's happening in the world. And that the event-driven architecture is really something that's enabled by having a message queue, having a messaging and streaming broker there. It essentially allows any application to plug into a flow of events that the organization is aware of, whether that's a new user sign-up, clicking on an advert, whether it's a new order, whether it's a change in the inventory levels, or whether it's a delay to an inventory shipment. There's a number of applications that can then react in real time to that and actually change things as you're going along. So it allows for much more real time reactivity to things happening in your organization.
Yeah, let me build on the idea of advertising and marketing. One of our clients is a major data aggregator and user of demographic information. They send you annoying emails and postcards and things you can't do with GDPR. But here in the States, right, the way their business works is if they already have the information, they don't have to pay for it, right? Because they use multiple services that provide that information. So one of the reasons they engaged us was to get richer information, but also to stop double and triple and quadruple paying for the same demographic information. So what we're able to do using Rabbitmq is we're able to message real time as they're pulling in data off of multiple sources, whether that's websites or databases, purchased information. But we're able to, and it's a requirement, right, to essentially reject a piece of information, which saves a lot of money. The second thing that we're able to do is if there's different information, we're actually able to compare that quickly. For example, I've got your address, I know your age, but I don't know your email or your income. But that just came in. I can add it, I can enrich it, I can pay for it and never pay for it again, right? So we can also do that data enrichment. Then what we do on the other side, right, which we talked about, is we send it out to a variety of customers. We send it to printers. We send it out to, email systems, all of the various ways that to of course tracking systems, use in keeping track of visits on websites. So they do this for customers. And what it does is change the speed in which they're able to do this, right? So previously, right, they'd go back and get a refund and have to comb through all this data and say, oh, we already had it. Here's the proof, right? We're able to real time eliminate it, and we do a much better job of it. And we can actually tell the difference on whether they had a single element that was valuable. They never were able to do that before. And what it allows us to do on the final piece is you can actually enrich on the fly. So one of the things you do with printing today, right, is you can do variable printing. Variable printing allows me to say, Ed, here's what you were interested in when you went to this website. Thanks so much for visiting and wanting to go to college all over again. And what we'd like to do is, right, send you some offer. Well, inside of that, right, we may or may not have the information to customize the offer, to customize where you're wanting to get particular information or where you visited. So as we're actually putting things through the next time, right, we're able to add that because you'll get multiple prints, right? You'll get 3, 4, 5 a letter, a postcard, an email, all from, particularly this company works with universities, right? So you'll get more and more information, more and more specific to you as we're actually able to collect more information about you.
Interesting.
And scary.
Well, yes and no. Recent episode was talking with someone with many, many years of experience in the email marketing space. And, that companies like Apple are making it harder and harder to get data on things like open rates and, who's opened the emails, who's shown some level of interest in the content. And while that's nice for data privacy, it's also for consumers in some ways, if you ask them if they want if they want to share that information, the answer is probably no. If you ask them if they want to get a bunch of bland emails with offers and things that are not going to interest them, and well, no, they kind of like the personalized stuff. So this is, there's a fine line that we're all trying to walk in the industry. There's a tightrope there where you want to delight the shopper, but you want to try to observe some level of privacy and be reasonable about that as well. And I think it is a case where the consumer doesn't necessarily know exactly what they want. The questions aren't always being asked in the right way where they understand the context of what the impact is going to be on them. Right. But yeah, we'll see. And I think, as in that episode, we talk about, the marketers have to rise to the occasion. And I think that in the end, these things typically do work out quite well. But coming back to message queuing, there are competing products to Rabbitmq in market. At JetRails, we like Rabbitmq not only because it is natively integrated with Magento 2, which for many of our customers is just, phenomenal. They don't have to do a lot of that legwork to start benefiting from the product. And, it's open source, so they can just spin it up in bare metal with us, really good cost on that. But there are others, and we certainly, like in the case of Xander's, we've got it in AWS, and that works absolutely just as well. But competing services like our partners at AWS do also have their own queuing services. Are there some things that stand out for you about Rabbitmq, other than, of course, the open source nature of it, which is near and dear for me?
Sure. Well, let's think about Xander's, for example, right? We moved them from another provider to JetRails, right? What this does with Rabbitmq is it gives you control and flexibility, right? If you used, for example, native, and it actually goes back to what Ed said, which is, look, if I'm using something native to another client, but I'm now stuck with that client, what it doesn't allow me to do is move from one set of providers, one set of technologies, right, to another. So that's actually one of the real problems with APIs. For example, Microsoft Great Plains, right? A little old in some cases of our customers, right? And let's say they upgrade, or let's say that they or they switch out to some other system. Well, we'd be rewriting a lot of APIs, and this allows for tremendous flexibility in your systems, so that you are not tied to just one set of systems, one set of ways of doing things, and making changes becomes much more cost effective, easy, and taking advantage of what it is the new infrastructure or new capabilities are. You get all of that automatically delivered to everything else you're connected to. Very often, our customers are connected to 6 or more different systems. And when you think about that, the importance of Rabbitmq is actually speed. Being able to tie new things in, and the cost differential is just really large. And while AWS, it's a great example. AWS is like the dominant player, but who knows? You never know in the future what's going to happen. And I would be very reluctant to tie my customers to something that says you have to do it this way.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to me, Rob, because one of the core tenets of what we like to do with Rabbitmq is connect all of the things and allow customers and users the flexibility to move between different architectures, different vendors, different cloud providers, and really allow that to happen. And that's one of the core things that our customers tell us. That's what they like about using Rabbitmq over other things. And to your point around flexibility, Rabbitmq speaks, multiple different protocols. It's not just AMQP. It's got 70 different client libraries that it can use. So whatever whatever programming language your application is written in, you're going to find something that works with Rabbitmq. So you can connect all of those things in together. We actually recently released. So we shouldn't just talk about message queuing here per se. We should talk also a little bit about streaming. And streaming is essentially, depending on who you ask, the definitions differ slightly, but streaming is the idea that rather than a message queue where messages disappear from that queue once they've been read or processed or consumed, a stream is where those messages, those events, those records persist on the queue. And that means that multiple applications can connect to that stream and they use the same source of data. They see the same data. That's the same source of truth. And that brings some interesting applications in things like doing analytics, doing time window analysis, doing event stream processing of the events in there, because you can have multiple applications connecting in, doing some analytics, and then presenting a result back to the user. The reason I mentioned that is because that's another string to Rabbitmq's bow, if you like. By using one broker, by using one solution, you're able not only to speak multiple protocols to different clients, but also to do things like streaming as well as message queuing. And so that flexibility and that broad range of use cases in one single broker is really something that our customers, our users tell us they love. And again, it is open source. We don't have any strategy or plan to change anything like that. It's the commercial elements, those commercial offerings, that's where we aim to make the money. And so that core Rabbitmq offering will always remain open source. So it's reliable, and that's not going away.
Yeah. And speaking of back to that open source community, what resources are available? So someone, your web developers or your agency like CoreShop is going to handle the technical side. Your host like JetRails is going to handle making sure that you have all the right resources to scale Rabbitmq and properly maintain and manage and monitor, keep your data safe, all that jazz, all that very important stuff. But what else is out there for these users to learn about it, to dip their toes in, to become aware, to get resources from that open source community?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the community is one of the things that I think, looking at other projects and other open source projects, I haven't seen a community as vibrant as the Rabbitmq community. There's pretty much anything you want to do. If you, if you use your Google foo well enough, then you'll find somebody else that's done it. But we also offer a number of other resources for folks apart from obviously the community. So VMware does offer training. So there's a 3-day course on Rabbitmq, which you're able to sign up and take. That's also available from other providers as well. We have a very vibrant Slack group, Slack channel, Slack instance, if you will. So that's at rabbitmq.slack.com, which receives a lot of traffic. Our GitHub discussions page is an avenue, a channel that's really taking off at the moment. We have a mailing list where a lot of questions get asked and answered. So we really keep, a lot of channels open to folks who want to ask questions about Rabbitmq. That's even before, they require any sort of support or training. So yes, there's a lot of information out there.
Well, I'll jump in on one thing, right? A lot of we're really pleased to be part of Rabbitmq, and what happens is a company will absolutely avail itself of resources, and then they decide, well, maybe we'd like someone who's done this before. And we get a lot of calls, right, for very small engagements, which we're happy to start small. We'll work with them, get things going, and then suddenly, because of the capabilities of Rabbitmq, it explodes into a larger project. And along the way, they're training internal resources, and my folks are building out some really great pathways and connections for them. So you can start small, you can learn, you can suddenly find out the benefits of Rabbitmq very, very quickly.
Awesome. Ed, you mentioned that you think you have the most vibrant open source community. For any of our listeners or viewers, I'm not going to share his address. Okay, I know you've got a better open source community. I know it's okay.
Oh,
yeah, them's fighting words in some of the you mentioned that. So you've got training courses that you provide. That there's a fee for. There are other commercial resources. What might push someone to more of those paid resources with the VMware team as it relates to Rabbitmq, as opposed to sticking completely open source as most of the Magento users that I'm running into today have been doing?
Sure. Yeah, I think the primary focus and the needs that our commercial offerings answer is really scalability. So if you find that you're, managing greater than 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 Rabbitmq instances, and some of our customers are managing, much greater number of instances than that, then those commercial offerings really aim to help standardize how you're deploying Rabbitmq. So they come with the dependencies prepackaged and security scanned. We also have a set of Kubernetes operators that allow you to do, automate day 0, day 1, and day 2 operations of managing Rabbitmq. So doing things like rolling upgrades of a Rabbitmq cluster, defining messaging topologies. So, the bindings, the queues, the exchanges, defining those as code and using the Kubernetes API to keep that messaging topology up to date. So really, it's that scale that we're looking for and what we're looking to serve with that brand. If you have a smaller number of Rabbitmq instances, and you're even seeing maybe only connecting a few components, then the open source offering is very powerful and allows you to do a lot with that. It's that when you start to grow, if you have multiple instances, then that's when we want to help out with some more commercial offerings that allow you to solve for those complex scaled use cases.
So basically, if your rabbits are multiplying, it's a real world problem.
Yeah, and that's actually
we're here to help.
That's funnily enough. To your earlier point, Robert, that's where the name comes from, because it was seen beyond enterprise service buses, which were kind of a centralized place. It was seen that Rabbit would be a distributed system, and you'd have rabbits, pockets of rabbits interacting and multiplying indeed as they went. So that was where actually the name originated from.
Look at that. I just renamed the company. All over here. We got to the same conclusion.
That's awesome.
That's fantastic. And before we start to wrap up, I wonder, any final thoughts, anything coming down the pike that you think users should be aware of, or anything we didn't touch on today that you think would be really valuable or impactful for our listeners? And why don't we start with you, Rob? Anything that we've we've left off for the day?
Yeah, let me just add that Rabbitmq gets placed in some surprising applications and uses, right? So Ed was just saying it's these little pockets, and I was listening to that thinking, interesting. We've actually mostly used it to connect everything, but we're not doing 50, 100 connections, right? Our customers are Magento too. Most of them love open source, but you do get to some larger companies, and we work with a few that are billion plus companies. And one of the things that I was just thinking about is, as you grow portals and you look at distribution, we have a customer that works with 2,500 retailers across the United States. There are opportunities to think and architect new solutions. And Rabbitmq allows you to do that. So one of the great things about my job is to think differently, come in and give different ideas. And as you begin to think about larger applications, exploring capabilities of the solution is going to open up new frontiers and new places for you to use it. So the thing that just sprung into my mind is, okay, how do we actually extend that into some of the retailer systems, right? So we can touch more data, touch and enrich and give better service from my client to their clients. And that's something I'm going to work on right away.
Yeah,
Awesome.
it's really interesting. I like coming on and talking to folks like Rob and Robert, and it's just hear a lot of commonalities and differences between different industries. So yes, we see a lot of customers using Rabbitmq to build a kind of data fabric, which is the idea that that messaging, that information, those events and records are spread across the organization. So it's really interesting to hear more about some of the retail customer examples you brought, Rob, to hear how they're using it, which is fantastic. I think in terms of what's coming up with RabbitMQ, I can certainly share a little bit on that. So the core offering is really the driving engine. By the core offering, I mean RabbitMQ itself. It's the driving engine. So it's currently very rock solid. It's resistant to network partitions. We're continuing to improve those things. We've also got additional resiliency capabilities coming up in the commercial offerings, things like having an active passive setup. So if you're thinking about you're getting big enough to the scale where you might have a couple of data centers, having the ability to automatically set up a RabbitMQ in a different data center so that if one region goes down, you're able to fail over to that. Those are the kinds of things that we're thinking about. So really in that core offering, we're thinking about that, the network partitions, the resiliency, security, data safety, and then those commercial elements of where we're broadening up to larger use cases and doing things like having an active passive disaster recovery setup.
Awesome. All right. No rest for the weary.
That's what it feels
That's
like.
tech for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, this has been fantastic. I've learned a lot, which is half the battle for me. I started a podcast knowing that I'd get to ask great questions of people with diverse and interesting knowledge sets. I really appreciate you giving your time today for our audience, and to that audience, as always, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll have more great content like this for you soon.